This is the Word Welders podcast, all about the world of writing and writers. If you write, read, or just stream movies and TV, Word Welders is for you. We open a window into the workings of the writer's mind. Each episode explores how writers find ideas, where they get their creative spark, and what drives them to plunge into the realms of imagination. Whether fact, fiction, fantasy, drama, or comedy, it starts with a writer. And we're going to hear from the source in the Word Welders podcast. I'm your host, Scott Moss. Welcome to the fourth episode of Word Welders, Writers on Forging Imagination. In this episode, we're going to speak with an academic student writer. Today's guest is a member of Phi Alpha Theta, the National History Honor Society, and has been selected to present a paper at this spring's Lyceum here at Tennessee Tech. Welcome to fellow student Marlee Miller.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So Marlee, just to begin, tell us a little bit about yourself and your pursuits here at Tech.
Yeah, so I am a double major in history and interdisciplinary studies, and I am involved in the history club and Phi Alpha Theta, like you said, and I am graduating in December, and then from there, I will be going on to law school.
Fantastic. Any choices for law school yet?
Not yet. No, I'm a little afraid. I haven't taken my LSAT yet, so I'm worried to fall in love with the school before I know what range of schools I'm eligible for. So I'm waiting a little bit of time before I start diving into research for that.
Circling back around to history, what interests you about history, and how do you decide what to research?
What has kind of striked me in history is, I mean, I've always loved it. My family, my grandparents are both very academic people. My papa was such like Travel Channel, History Channel, all the time kind of person. And so I just kind of grew up around my family having very like academic kind of conversations. And then from there, I just kind of fell in love with it, and I really love women's history. That's kind of my niche topic that I always find myself gravitating towards for one reason or another. So that's generally how I decide my topics, but I also have a strong sense of advocacy and activism. I try to pursue that in my day-to-day life, and that's I try to find pieces of history that kind of connect with that as well.
Fantastic. And this paper you're presenting this Friday, actually, what's your paper about?
Yeah, so my paper is about the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s, but I'm more so talking about discrimination in healthcare, and I'm using the AIDS epidemic as a case study to kind of further explain the negative effects that can come from discrimination in healthcare and how it can affect a population.
Every paper presents us with a problem at some point. What's the most difficult or problematic stumbling block? For lack of a better phrase, the stumbling block as you pushed forward with this idea.
So the hardest part for me when writing any paper is just starting it. I find it really, I get kind of like this paralysis before I start a paper because there's a part of me that's a bit of a perfectionist, and I want everything to be perfect before I start, and I want everything to kind of, I want it to almost already be done before I even start doing it, which I know makes absolutely no sense. So I have a hard time beginning my papers, but once I kind of have made myself sit down and just start doing it, a lot of times the flow kind of happens naturally after that. I also struggle a lot with citations and formatting. That's the hardest part for me, and I usually always get some kind of help with that. I don't know why. The paper always flows really well, and I almost always enjoy my topic that I'm writing about. But by the time I get to citations and formatting it, it's just not my speed. I can't help it.
So it sounds like what most of us could use as a student would be a great editor.
Yes, I would love that.
That would take care of that. I have the same issue. English history double major, and of course in English it's MLA. In history it's Chicago style.
Yes.
And just close enough that it's the differences that catch you.
Yeah, exactly. I know my paper that I'm writing right now is I'm have to write it in APA. Whereas my other paper that I'm writing this semester is in Chicago, but I've grown up writing MLA. So there's just all these different tiny minute differences within the different styles that makes it hard to kind of remember what falls where.
Exactly. And MLA, for that matter, was just changed not too long ago. I think 2009 major changes were made to MLA. So those of us that learned it earlier in life, like I did, now it's different. In your paper topic, is there something that you found that surprised you with that project?
Honestly, the most surprising part of it for me was how much I fell in love with it. I didn't really know what I was going to write about. My interdisciplinary studies double major, it focuses on community health and social advocacy. So my paper kind of had to tie into both of those things, but history is kind of who I am at heart. So I wanted it to also be a historical paper. So I had to find some way to tie in all three of these topics together. And so I was kind of conversing back and forth with my advisor, and I kind of was speaking out loud, and I just said, well, what if I talk about discrimination in healthcare, and I talk about, we'll say, the AIDS epidemic and how horrific that was for folks because of the discrimination and biases that fell with having it being HIV positive. And she was like, well, that's great, let's do that. And I was like, oh, okay, sure, let's do that. So that kind of decided my topic. And as I started writing it, at first I hit a lot of, I guess, going back to the roadblocks, I had a hard time kind of finding my groove with it and finding how I wanted to talk about it. Because, you can do a 10-page historical record of the AIDS epidemic. You could talk about purely discrimination in healthcare with this as examples. And I just had a hard time kind of formulating it. But once I started mapping it out and stuff like that, I found that I really enjoyed talking about how strong these people were and how much they had to overcome, and how there were a lot of people and a lot of organizations and foundations that really just laid a lot of groundwork that really helped a lot of people, and I really just fell in love with that.
So that brings me to a point that I hadn't planned on, but for those of us from my generation, many of us lost close friends to AIDS. Mm-hmm. I know personally of 3 people right off the top of my head that I both worked with and knew as friends that died from AIDS. And we see media cover that sort of topic. A movie like Dallas Buyers Club, for instance. Mm-hmm. Did you find that media emphasis, or the way that the medical profession reacted to the epidemic, how did those things kind of interrelate?
Yeah, that's actually a large part of my paper, is especially in the early parts where it was just news articles from like the New York Times or something like that, where there were people dying of this mysterious, quote, cancer. Even like it kind of reminds me a little bit, as I've done my research, of how people reacted to COVID when it first happened. Because when it first happened, there were a lot of unanswered questions. And I think that kind of ties into this. There were a lot of unanswered questions, so people were fighting back and forth over, okay, people were going to Walmart with the hula hoops on, trying to maintain that 6 feet distance. And, there were a lot of reactions and and that kind of ties back to this, but it's different in the sense that those overreactions were not based on, they were based on fear, but also biases and discrimination and homophobia that had already existed. So it kind of was this building blocks of just a lot of different emotions that were flying around that caused it to be a lot more terrifying, I guess, to people than it maybe needed to be.
And that really kind of leads into my follow-up question for that. For our listeners who may not be as excited about history as you or me, what is the big takeaway in your paper, and why does that matter to our non-history students?
Yeah, so my paper about half of it is a historical account of the AIDS epidemic with personal accounts from people and just straight up history. The other half is how that history and how that medical history, how it was handled then, and how we can use that information now to handle things like COVID or something like that. Like when another epidemic pops up that may target a specific population or maybe doesn't, maybe targets everybody, how can we take the information that we know already happened and how can we utilize that? That's honestly one of my favorite parts of history, and that's one of the reasons I chose history, actually. I really love learning about how things were handled historically and how things were utilized historically and how we can use that historical information now and how we can improve the lives of people now with that information. That's one of the drives I have with learning history.
So Friday, April 21st, is the Lyceum. What happens after that? More studies to follow, more research, more papers.
Yeah, after the Lyceum, I will be working on my other paper that's due for a different class, and I will be working on studying for finals. I will be transitioning into working full-time at my job as opposed to just part-time because we're leading into summer, and then getting ready for next semester.
Very well. A very hearty thank you to Marlee. We hope you enjoyed being here as much as we enjoyed having you as a guest, and we thank all of you for listening to Word Welders. Please share our links with your friends. We always welcome new subscribers. And if you have an idea for an episode or just want to comment on what you hear on Word Welders, reach out on email to wordwelderspodcast@gmail.com.